So over the past day and a half, we've had great conversations uncovering the scope and scale of the threat posed by China, from technology, supply chains, and cybersecurity and cyber operations to the deadly fentanyl crisis. What remains is defining a full-spectrum national strategy to address these challenges. And there's no one better to lead this discussion than Vanderbilt's very own Lieutenant General Charlie Tuna Moore. General Moore is a distinguished visiting professor at Vanderbilt and formerly Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command. General Moore rose through the ranks as a decorated command pilot with more than 3,000 hours in the F-16 and more than 640 hours of combat time. He's an expert tactician in and above the battlefield. As he rose through the ranks at the Air Force, General Moore's role became increasingly operational and strategic, including working with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as Deputy Director of Global Operations, and at Cyber Command, where he executed the organization's mission to synchronize and coordinate cyberspace planning and operations. Even more relevant to today's conversation is that General Moore is an avid poker player. In case anyone's interested, Texas Hold'em is his game. Now, you might wonder, how is poker relevant? Well, here's the thing. To be a great poker player, you have to master the concept of conditional probabilities. Every single card that's dealt changes the probability of the right next move and forces each player to reassess their hand. Our unique challenge today is that the velocity at which these cards are being dealt has been increasing at a dizzying pace. We've spent much of the last couple of days talking about the speed at which the modern threat landscape is changing and how technology is impacting modern conflict. With these new conditions for modern conflict, we need to assume that making precise predictions is increasingly difficult. We're operating in a world of conditional probabilities. Each move the adversary makes will change our right next move. But that's not where the importance of being a great poker player ends. Importantly, great poker players don't just play the hand they're dealt. They play the players. Today, we're facing Xi and Beijing. Their game is tight, it's disciplined, and it's professional, and they're playing to win the World Series of Poker no matter how long it takes. To face this competitor effectively, we have to have a compelling full-spectrum national strategy for China that takes into account the cards that China's holding, the cards that we're holding, as well as the mindset of each of the players. Given his deft poker game, General Moore is the perfect person to moderate the discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, Nilu. I appreciate that kind introduction. I also appreciate you bringing up my gambling habits with all the members of law enforcement that are in attendance. I also want to thank everybody that came to Nashville to attend the summit, and also those that joined us online through the live feed. Also for your continued engagement with the questions that we've been getting for our speakers and for the panelists. They've been extremely thoughtful and have advanced the conversation. And you're going to have that opportunity to continue to do that with this panel as well. So like through the rest of the summit, up behind me on the slide is the link, the email that you can send your questions. We'll do our best to get to many of those as possible during the time that we have allotted. So with that said, this afternoon I do have the distinct pleasure of hosting our final panel of the summit entitled Securing the Future, Defining a Full Spectrum National Security for China. Now, we placed this panel at the end of the day, as Nilu mentioned, so that we could hopefully talk about a lot of the lessons and issues that came up in the last 2 days and synthesize those and talk about what should be an overarching strategy or approach for the United States as it relates to China. To help us do that, we have put together a panel of 5 extremely impressive individuals. And I'd like to begin by giving each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves to all of you. So, Morgan?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm a Nashvilleian and live about 5 minutes from here, so it's nice to be back at Vanderbilt as always. And just to put a little plug in, we just finished the last of our Ambassador Speaker Series here at Vanderbilt, and we'll start again at the fall, and hope all of you will be able to join us. I have been in government for about 20 years. I'm still in the Navy Reserves, running out to drill right after this, actually. My last job in government was a spokesperson to Secretary Mike Pompeo, and I've lived and worked mostly in the Middle East since then, and I'm thrilled to be here. So thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. Gordon?
I'm Gordon Chang, live in Bedminster, New Jersey. I'm a writer. Before that, for a quarter century, I practiced law in, among other places, New York, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, I met my wife. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me, and she told me to say it, so. But in any event, I am so pleased to be here today.
Thank you. And Matt?
I'm Matt Pottinger. I run a China-focused open source research company called Garnaut Global LLC. I served during the Trump administration as the senior director for Asia and then as the deputy national security advisor. And I have a book coming out shortly, if I can plug it, which is called The Boiling Moat: Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. Thanks.
Great. Colin?
Hey, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm Colin Kahl. I'm a professor at Stanford University. I served in the Biden administration for the first 2.5 years of the current administration as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which, if you don't know anything about the Pentagon, is essentially the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. And I served previously in the Obama administration at the Pentagon as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Middle East and as then Vice President Biden's National Security Advisor.
Rush?
Thanks so much, Tuna. So my name is Rush Doshi. I'm currently at the Council on Foreign Relations, where we have a new program, a China Strategy Initiative that I'm directing. In addition, I'll also be an incoming professor at Georgetown University starting this fall. Before these very recent professional moves, I was actually at the National Security Council for about a little more than 3 years, working on China, including most recently as the Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan Affairs. Thanks.
Thanks, Rush. Okay, so let's dive right into the questions. I don't think any thoughtful discussion on China can really be had without first accurately defining and describing the environment between our two nations. Yet, interestingly enough, there's quite a bit of disagreement on that point. The current administration insists we are in a period of great power competition and that China is the United States' pacing challenge. Others believe the environment is much closer to what we experienced during the Cold War, except with a much more formidable economic and military capable adversary. I will also add that this latter view seems to be much more aligned with the rhetoric we hear from Chinese President Xi. So which is it? Are we in a period of competition, something more akin to the Cold War, or something completely different? Gordon, why don't we begin with you?
Thanks, Tuna. I think we should take our cue from what the Chinese regime says about us. So, for instance, in May 2019, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, carried a landmark editorial which declared a quote-unquote people's war in America. Now, we're Americans and we dismiss propaganda, but for the regime, people's war means total war. And it's actually worse than this because I think that the regime views the United States as an existential threat. And it's because an insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of America's values and form of governance on the Chinese people. So they view this as a do-or-die struggle against the United States. And it's not just against the US, because Xi Jinping, throughout this century, has been amplifying themes throughout the Communist Party, period. And he says, basically, that he's trying to impose China's imperial-era system, where Chinese emperors believe that they not only had the mandate of heaven to rule what they call Tianxia, or all under heaven, but that heaven actually compelled them to do so. Which means that if you're an American, an Australian, or an Armenian, basically Beijing doesn't view you as a citizen of another sovereign state. They think that you're a vassal of the grand celestial Chinese court.
Thank you, Rush. What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks. This is a really important question. I'm glad you started us off with it. I think, the question, are we in a Cold War, is an interesting one, but it turns a lot on terminology. What do we mean by the term Cold War? Because the Cold War wasn't just one event. It was a series of different seasons. There were moments of détente, and then there were moments where it looked like there could be nuclear escalation, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So rather than ask the question, are we in a Cold War, which I think is interesting, important, provocative, I think it's maybe useful to focus on what are the fundamental characteristics of the competition we're in now. And if you ask me, my personal view, and I wrote about this in some of my own work, a book I had come out a few years ago called The Long Game, there's a few key assumptions I think we can all make about China's intentions and ambitions. The first is that China seeks to basically displace the United States within the Indo-Pacific and then globally as the world's leading power. That's an important assumption. I think there's a lot of evidence for that assumption, but people debate it. I happen to believe that assumption has more to support it than to detract from it. The The second sort of assumption is that the competition with China spans pretty much every global region and also almost every policy domain. So it's a full competition across the widest array of geographic domains and policy domains. But the final assumption is critical, which is that China's really not going to go anywhere anytime soon. They're going to be here in one way or the other for the foreseeable future. So within those first two assumptions, there has to be some fundamental way for the United States and China to sort of live alongside each other. And a lot of the competition is about negotiating the terms of that fundamental fact while advancing American interests and values. I want to just build on what Gordon said, which is a little bit about the Chinese perspective on this competition, because I think we can't just look at it from our perspective, we have to think about their perspective. And their perspective increasingly, well, is that basically since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been a very intense competitor. We didn't always see it that way in America, but they saw it that way. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after Tiananmen Square, after the demonstration of American military power in the Gulf War, after this trifecta of events, they began to be more concerned about the threat the United States posed, that they perceived it posing. And it was very difficult to reassure them that maybe we don't pose a threat, even at a time when we were taking all kinds of conciliatory steps. So that's the worldview they inhabit. And I want to end by just noting what are the stakes of this competition? Where could this go? And I think you don't have to go much further than looking at the text that Chinese academics, think tankers, and the Chinese Communist Party put out, the text that I spent my own career before government studying. And I think if you take all that together, you come up with maybe a few ideas about where they want to go. First, a global military capable of global power projection, but also capable of recapturing, in their view, Taiwan, which they think has gotten away. On the economic side, they want the world dependent on China's supply chains, but they want to be less dependent on the supply chains of the world. So it's asymmetric interdependence in China's favor. On the technology side, they want to lead the commanding heights of all the new technology we talk about and discussed yesterday and today at this conference. And in particular, they think that the world proceeds geopolitically through a series of industrial and technological revolutions. The first one was steam powered, the Brits won that one. The second one was electrification. The third one was mechanization, from Edison to Ford, basically. And America won those and built its geopolitical position on that foundation. And now we've got artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and they want to win that. The final piece here is the political competition, and I think they have a sense that broadly the default views and values in the world are sort of liberal, and they want it to be a bit more agnostic. They want a world safe for their authoritarian system. So that's the broad stakes of the competition, and obviously for us, the key question is how do we advance our interests and values in face of their competitive approach? Thanks.
Thanks, Rush. Colin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think both Rush and Gordon make important points. I think that there are elements of the current competition that feel like the Cold War. It's a very intense competition. It's a very global competition. There's a degree to which there's a blockification of a lot of ecosystems, security, economic, technological. So those parts of it feel Cold War-ish. The challenge is if it's capital C, capital W, Cold War, this is not the Cold War. Because the differences are as stark as the similarities. We were never economically interdependent with the Soviet Union. We are extraordinarily economically independent with China, and while we can de-risk and decouple in some areas, we cannot completely disentangle our two economies without wrecking our economy and the global economy, and it's not going to happen. That was never a dilemma we had to face during the Cold War, capital C, capital W. The other part is that while China has territorial ambitions, it does not have the global territorial ambitions, nor the same view of how to manifest those ambitions that the Soviet Union did. China is a threat to Taiwan. It's a threat in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, along the disputed border with India, but it doesn't have classic imperial territorial ambitions in the way that the Soviet Union did, nor is it looking to foment revolution around the world. What it is looking to do, rather than spreading communist ideology, is to spread its methodology of digital authoritarianism in a way to make the world safe for autocracy. And a world safe for autocracy isn't, by definition, not safe for democracy, and therefore this is not to downgrade the threat. It's just that I don't know that we should conflate it with the ideological and territorial struggle in many respects that the Cold War was. The only other thing that I would caution is I do think that we have to measure our frame on China against the possibility of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because China's not going anywhere. And we're going to be in an intense competition. In fact, my office wrote the 2022 National Defense Strategy that defined China as the pacing challenge to the United States, because it's the only country that is capable of challenging us militarily, economically, diplomatically, and technologically, and increasingly has the intention to displace us as the world's leading power. But a conflict with China would be disastrous. It would be disastrous for them, for us, and the world, and we just need to measure our frames so that we don't unintentionally create a self-fulfilling prophecy of a conflict that certainly they don't want, we don't want, and the world doesn't want.
Thank you. And several of you touched on the economic aspect of this relationship, and this was touched on a bit during a panel yesterday, in fact, the very first panel. But many are of the view that we have not fully acknowledged the demographic and economic challenges that China currently faces. They are no longer the world's most populous nation. Their population actually contracted by about 2 million people last year. Their one-child policies are coming home to roost. This has led to a rapidly aging population with a decreasing workforce. Additionally, the commercial real estate market that makes up about 25% of their GDP is facing serious challenges, and China's exports fell 4.6% last year. That's the first time that's happened since 2016. And foreign investment dollars, that was mentioned on one of the panels yesterday, are also down. What does all this mean to China economically, and how should the United States and our allies respond? Is it time to lend a hand, or should we be taking steps to take advantage of the situation? Morgan.
Thank you. Never want to get in the way of your enemy or your competitor or whatever you want to call them. If they are having a moment of weakness, let them have that moment. I think many of us would be concerned about the decisions that Xi Jinping makes in a faltering economy, right? That's when you start to wonder, does he make the calculus and make decisions about the Second Thomas Shoal or about Taiwan or other places because he needs to win over domestic support? I think that the best way to highlight the troubles of the Chinese economy is to highlight what's best about the American, the European, the system of the West, right? Our transparency, the fact that we have accountability, that we have reforms, that we have democratic processes. During COVID, I think we were all hearing some really incredible rhetoric that was hard for many of us to stomach when you were hearing that, well, maybe the authoritarian system is better. Maybe they're handling COVID better. Meanwhile, they're locking people in apartments and sealing up the doors and letting them die of COVID. But still, there was that naivete out there. And so I think in a moment of economic weakness in China, it's a good reminder to people who may have made decisions, for example, to be a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, or American corporations that have done business in China and have seen the intellectual property theft and have seen their margins and their sales go down every year. It's a good time to remind the world why our system of government in America and in the West, why our system of government, why our system of transparency, why these things are so fundamentally important when you're making investment decisions. I mean, listen, clearly, there needs to be massive reforms in both the property, real estate, banking sector in China. The economy is not necessarily Xi Jinping's forte, so I don't know if he's going to be able to make those reforms. But I think no matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat administration, we obviously have President Biden right now. In the Trump administration, under Matt and Dave Stilwell, our assistant secretary at the State Department, we spent a lot of time thinking about the concept of reciprocity. So how are American individuals, how are American companies treated in China? And how are news organizations, how are people, how are companies, how our products are treated in China? We thought that they should be treated the same way in the United States. And I think if we can use the concept of reciprocity as a guiding light for how we manage this competition between the two countries, I think from an economic perspective, that would help. I would say, listen, I'm probably one of the more hawkish members on this panel. I do use the word competition. I don't like it because I think whether or not we think we're in a full-blown Cold War with the Chinese or not, they certainly are with us in almost every area, certainly in space and cyberspace. I mean, Colin knows the defense angle better than anybody, just having overseen it for the past 3 years. I don't like the word competition, especially when you think about it from an economic perspective, because I think it's a softer way of making American investment funds and companies who are doing business with the PLA to feel better about themselves. And I think fundamentally American businesses and American corporations are going to have to ask themselves, can you do business with the United States, maybe with our Defense Department or with other key national security agencies, and can you do business in China? And I think increasingly that answer is no.
Matt, what are your views?
Well, the historian John Lewis Gaddis says that historians fall into two categories, lumpers and splitters. So the lumpers like to see the continuity or the similarities from different chapters of history. Splitters find the differences, and Colin gave a pretty good lay down of both examples. What are some of the similarities with the Cold War? What are some of the differences? I think that, also Rush gave a very good accounting of how Beijing views this competition, which is really in existential terms. I think that we do ourselves a favor by looking to the Cold War for the lessons that helped us prevail in that competition without the need for a hot war directly, which would have been disastrous between the United States and the Soviet Union. The risk of not acknowledging those similarities, and that this is, to Morgan's point, more than just a gentlemanly competition that's taking place right now. We're in a serious struggle for the future soul of the world. President Biden put it well, I think, 6 weeks into his administration when he said this is really about whether the world is going to be free and open and democratic primarily, or whether it's going to be run by autocracies with ideas that are fundamentally hostile to our way of life. There is a certain zero-sum aspect to this, and Beijing views it in extremely zero-sum terms. So the advantage of us acknowledging that a Cold War is being waged against us, and then looking to some of the great lessons how we won that Cold War, looking at I like how Rush put it, that there were different seasons of that Cold War. One of those seasons was détente, which was a way of describing really the 1970s. The United States was losing and then lost a war in Vietnam. We were licking our wounds from that. We tried an approach whereby we would try to downplay differences with the Soviets. We would reduce overall our defense expenditures. We would try to silo areas where we could cooperate with the Soviets off from areas where we could, where we really had to compete head on with them. And in the end, I think the judgment of history was that set of policies was a failure for the United States. This was the Nixon administration, Ford administration, and early Carter administration policies. And it was only maybe 3 years into the Carter administration that President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski was an interesting guy. He was someone who had grown up in Poland. He had seen the tragedy of totalitarian ideologies ravaging Europe, whether they were, the Bolsheviks and Lenin and Stalin, or the rise of Mussolini and Hitler. And he came to view détente as something that wasn't working, that the nature of this approach where we would really try really hard to get along with the Soviets was actually giving the Soviets a big advantage, because they would tie us up in things that we wanted while continuing to damage the interests of the United States and our allies by launching wars in Africa, in Latin America. They invaded Afghanistan. And so finally, Brzezinski said, you know what, after the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets, he said to Jimmy Carter, we're going to make this the Soviets' version of Vietnam. And they shifted away from the policy of a détente, and that really set the table for President Reagan's entry into the Oval Office a little over a year later. And within a decade, he had won the Cold War, not by soft pedaling or looking for areas where we might be able to cooperate, celebrate, but by calling out very candidly the things that the Soviet Union was doing, both to its own people, to repress them at home, but also their compulsive hostility towards us and our interests beyond their borders. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Let's shift a little bit and talk about the military. China continues to grow its capabilities at an alarming rate. It can be argued that setting aside the U.S. Air Force, the size of China's Navy, Army, Space, and Cyber forces already exceed those of the United States. Additionally, the technological qualitative edge the United States possesses continues to decrease. All this military growth falls within the backdrop of an increasing tensions in the East and South China Seas. Confrontations on the sea and in the air between our two nations are becoming more common occurrence, and China's approach to Taiwan seems becoming more aggressive. So is a military confrontation between China and the United States inevitable? And if so, does China view their success as so existential to the CCP that nuclear weapons could be a possibility? Let's begin with Colin.
So I don't think it is inevitable, nor do I think that it's imminent, but it is quite plausible. And I think that we need to distinguish those things. Look, a lot has been made about whether Xi Jinping has a date on his calendar for invading Taiwan. I don't think he does. I don't think anybody knows except for him. He has certainly told his military they need to be ready by 2027 from a capability perspective. But that is oftentimes conflated in the public imagination as if they're going to invade Taiwan in 2027. I'm quite confident he has not made that decision yet. It doesn't mean he won't, but he hasn't made it yet. They are in the midst of the most breathtaking military modernization since the 1930s, and we should take that seriously. We describe China as the pacing challenge in the 2022 National Defense Strategy. We have been China's pacing challenge since at least the 1990s. Since the Gulf War, then the Taiwan Strait crisis of 95, 96, then the inadvertent bombing of their embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo War. They have pursued us as their North Star against which they measure themselves militarily, and they've designed their entire military around that. And in practice, that meant that they have made massive investments in anti-access area denial capabilities to make it very dangerous for the U.S. military to operate within the first island chain and increasingly beyond the first island chain. And they've invested enormous resources in counter-network capabilities, especially in cyber and in outer space, because they know the American way of war relies on those domains, and they intend to hold it at risk. We are only now, starting in the Trump administration and continuing in the Biden administration, I think there's actually more continuity than discontinuity on this score, to take that challenge seriously. My view is we are perfectly capable of deterring China from making a move on our allies and partners in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and in Taiwan, and that actually the conflict in Ukraine has been a quite sobering moment for the Chinese military, because it feeds a lot of the anxiety Xi Jinping has about his military, that he can't trust his military, that they might be corrupt, that they might look good on paper, but it turns out in real life, real war is real hard. That Russia looked like the second best military in the world the day they invaded Ukraine, and barely looked like the second best military in Ukraine a day later. And that a lot of the technologies that have manifest in Ukraine, a mix of old school firepower and new school commercial technologies, have been heavily defense dominant, to include in the naval domain, to the point that was discussed earlier about the Black Sea. And keep in mind, what China might have in mind for Taiwan would be the most difficult logistical and military joint expression of power that any military has engaged in since the Second World War. And in fact, more complicated than that, because it would include a lot more domains. I believe that the existing overmatch that the U.S. military has, especially in some key domains that are likely to persist, like undersea, the investments that we've made over the last several years across two administrations, the wake-up call that Ukraine has served to Taiwan itself, the possibility of asymmetric capabilities to make life hell, not just for China to get to the beach, but they have to get to the beach not just once. They have to get there every single day to put more men on the beach, more fuel on the beach, more supplies on the beach. They then have to crawl through the jungles and tunnels and urban areas. And Xi Jinping does not want to fight a 2-year war like the Russians He wants to fight a two-week war. And we have the possibility of working alongside Taiwan and our partners in the region to convince him there is no two-week war. This is a war he probably won't win, and if it does, even to launch this adventure would be to put the survival of the CCP at stake because the war will be a hard slog. So I think that the war is not imminent or inevitable. I think we have lots of opportunity to deter it from happening. I think Xi Jinping has a lot of doubts about his ability to pull this off. But, and this is the point I'll conclude in, there is a period of danger. And I think the period of maximum danger starts at the end of this decade, when China might be able to tell itself a story that they have the capabilities to defeat Taiwan and hold the US military at bay for long enough, where they have become a peer in cyberspace and increasingly in the nuclear domain. That window may open toward the end of this decade. But then I think it may snap shut by the mid-2030s, when a lot of our military modernization will have come online, and some of the headwinds, economic, demographic, and otherwise, put some constraints on China. So I think actually it's those years between the late 2020s and the mid-2030s that are probably the most dangerous years to navigate, because the window will open and then it might snap shut just at a time where Xi Jinping is going to be pretty old. And so if he really sees this as a legacy achievement. So nothing that I've said about it not being inevitable means that we can be sanguine about it. We have to treat the challenge urgently, and especially to navigate that particularly dangerous moment. But I think we have a lot of opportunities to do so.
Thank you. Gordon, how do you see it?
I was agreeing with Colin all the way through that until the last moment when you started to talk about when is the window of opportunity. Because I think that the window of opportunity is open now, and it probably closes when the 2030s start. And the reason is you have a China right now that is in turmoil. You have Chinese people who are going through, for the first time in their lives, for most of them, a downturn. You know, Chinese people didn't even know that there was a concept of a downturn until now. And you have a very unhappy population, and we can see this with those extraordinary protests that began in October of 2022 and lasted for about 3 months, about a number of different things. And that shows that Chinese society right now is volatile. You know, Xi Jinping has these grand ambitions. We know them because he tells us about them. But the point is that he realizes that he probably only has a limited period of time in which to realize them. Because Chinese economy right now, and the driver of China's rise, is in distress. It's not growing at the 5.3% pace that they claimed for the first quarter. Bloomberg just a few hours ago issued a story which said the Chinese people are puzzled by that report because they can feel the downturn. And the problem for Xi is a couple of things. First of all, he's a Marxist, a Maoist, and although he doesn't have the power to implement Maoist solutions, he's pushing China in that direction, which is aggravating China's problems. But he knows he's changed the political system. So for instance, when he became General Party Secretary at the end of 2012, he inherited a consensual political system where no Chinese leader got too much credit or too much blame because every leader signed off on every decision of consequence. But by grabbing power, he's also grabbed total accountability or near total accountability. And to make it worse for himself, he's raised the cost of losing political struggles. So if you got near total accountability, you know that if you lose, you can lose everything. And the country is falling apart underneath you, because there are a lot of things that you've talked about, then it seems that he has a real incentive to lash out. And I agree it's not Taiwan, because Taiwan is too hard. But it could be the Philippines. Just a few hours ago, Manila announced that there were 55 Chinese vessels in Philippine waters. We have seen some very, very dangerous acts on the part of the Chinese at Second Thomas Shoal, Scarborough Shoal, Whitsun Reef, and other places. And so this might be the easy target for Xi Jinping to lash out. So I believe that we need to be prepared for anything at any place at any time, but especially now. Remember that President Biden himself, a week ago, issued a warning that we were prepared to use our force against China to discharge our obligations pursuant to the mutual defense treaty that we have with the Philippines. That's a repeat of October 25th warning from President Biden issued on the steps of the White House. The State Department last month, issued 2 written warnings that we were prepared to go to war with China on the 5th and the 29th. The Chinese are ignoring all of these, which says that probably something is very wrong inside the Chinese capital. We don't know what it is, but we know all the problems in the rocket force, which controls almost all of the country's nuclear weapons. We could see the problem with the former defense minister who was picked by Xi Jinping last year and was sacked almost immediately. Something is very, very wrong in China right now, and that means they can lash out. Because Xi Jinping, one final point, the Chinese people don't want war, but Xi Jinping might want a war because that's the best way to prevent his opponents in the political system from deposing him.
Morgan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I actually just got back from Taiwan a couple of days ago, and I will tell you, I was last there 6 years ago, and the difference in the heightened sense of urgency from the leadership. We met with the outgoing President Tsai, incoming President Lai, and his top team. It was markedly different from when I was there 6 years ago. They are encouraged when they hear President Biden say things like, "Yes, we are going to fight for Taiwan." Which obviously is, technically our policy is on strategic ambiguity. I think that makes them feel good. But when they see Ukraine, and they were very circumspect about this, when they see Ukraine, they are worried about what the West's commitment would be towards them. And I think the reason why we've had this policy of strategic ambiguity is because it doesn't matter who wins in November. This would be an incredibly tough decision for President Biden or President Trump to actually start to send in our fleets, right? And to actually make the decision to commit U.S. resources. So I say that to say that, Gordon just mentioned that he didn't think it's Taiwan, perhaps it's the Philippines. I can tell you that the Taiwanese definitely feel like they're next on the chopping block. And I'm sure that they were trying to convey that sense of urgency to us so that we would offer the commitments that they feel like they need in order to protect them. I think the key thing that we're talking about here is deterrence. And obviously, we want to do everything that we can do to deter a war from happening. And the key questions is, are we doing the right things to deter a war? Does our rhetoric actually match our policy? I would argue that it doesn't. And this is on both Republicans and Democrats. When you have China that will have 395 ships next year, U.S. Navy will have 292. There's absolutely no way going out to 2030 that we're going to be able to keep up with their ship building capacity unless we have major changes in our industrial base in the United States. We just cut one of our attack submarines from the budget, for next year. And again, House Republicans were a major factor in this budget as well, so a plague on both of their houses. I think that the rhetoric that we extend towards China doesn't match our military budget, and so ergo, you're not deterring China if you're not serious about getting our Navy in shape. And I often hear people sort of dismiss it and say, well, the Chinese haven't fought a war in a long time. Well, neither has our Navy, right? I mean, right now we're fending off the Houthis. Our guys and gals, our sailors are doing a great job of doing that. But we similarly haven't fought a naval battle in a long time either. And so the one thing that I would say, the one thing that worries me the most is that I think we are guilty in Washington of talking tough, of acting tough on China, but we don't have the military budget to support that rhetoric. And I think that we need to get serious on that. Further, I would say, the best thing that we could do is be consistent in our policy as it relates to American adversaries. And right now we've seen for at least the last 12 years, when I'm around explaining this on television and to what I call Gen Pop, I say Xi Jinping and Putin have had a bromance, for the past 12 years. They became besties, however you want to call it. So this is not something that happened overnight. But clearly when Xi Jinping meets with Putin and says we're going to see a change in the world order that we haven't seen in 100 years, I think I believe him when he says that. And obviously you now see Iran, DPRK, Russia, and China in a new unholy alliance, new axis of evil, whatever you want to call it. And when we're not consistent in our policy, whenever you see China buying Iranian and Russian oil on a daily basis, then we're just not serious about the Russia-Ukraine war. We're just not serious about stopping Iran from attacking Israel and another of our Middle Eastern allies. allies. So until we start to apply policy consistently across China, DPRK, Iran, and Russia, and specifically taking Iranian and Russian oil off the market, until we actually do that, I think it's a rhetoric exercise.
Thank you, Morgan. So here's a question that we have in regards to diplomacy. The United States security strategy, national defense strategy, national military strategies all harp on the vital importance of partnerships when it comes to dealing with China. Some have said that China has transactional relationships while the United States looks to develop and cultivate true partners. Is this true, and if so, does it matter? And how can the U.S. use it to its advantage? Rush?
No, thanks, Tuna. This is a really interesting question because I think it gets to what Morgan just ended on, which is you have this kind of light sort of bloc politics forming in certain elements of the world where you have greater coordination between China, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK now than you did 5 years ago, which is unusual. What I think is interesting about our conversation is we've talked a lot about what the U.S. needs to do. But the competition with China isn't about the U.S. acting alone. It's about the U.S. acting in partnership with its greatest national advantage, with this unique alliance structure, this unique network of alliances and partnerships all around the world. And I think a key thing you've seen in the last 3.5 years that the Biden administration tried to do, and the Trump administration tried before that, but I think we've made real progress, maybe escape velocity in the last few years, is networking this set of relationships together. And I'll just offer you some really important examples. The Biden administration came in and basically elevated the Quad, that's India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, to the leader level for the first time. There have been several meetings now of this grouping. AUKUS, this incredibly important submarine agreement with Australia, now on the table. Colin's team engineered some really important postural adjustments across the Indo-Pacific that are very, very important. People talked about those for 10 years. We worked hand in glove with that team over at DoD and the State Department to make that happen. And now the stuff that people put in white papers, or rather policy papers, is now actual policy. Some examples with our allies. Take Japan. Japan is doubling its defense budget. It's acquiring new offensive capabilities. It's doing exercises with us that are really sophisticated. There's all kinds of integration happening. You take the Philippines. I mean, again, the U.S.-Philippine relationship, nobody knew where that was going to be 3 years ago. It's a very close relationship, and that matters right now as we see all kinds of challenges in Second Thomas Shoal, many of which are unprecedented. It's better to be coordinated when you face that situation than to be divided, and you have that coordination today, which is truly unique. And you look at some of the ways in which we've knitted together friends. It's not just the U.S. and a country, not just hub and spoke. It's actually about putting a tire around those spokes. So you've got the United States, Japan, and the Philippines meeting together at the leader level. That is a big deal. You have United States, Japan, and Korea meeting together at the leader level too. Why does that matter? Because Japan and Korea have a somewhat fraught relationship, and it's been a holy grail of Northeast Asian policy to get them to work more closely together. That happened. No one thought it could happen, but that happened in the last 3 years. The reason I mention all of that is it has real implications, not just for the security competition, not just for Taiwan, but for economic competition, for political competition, for every domain. Because the United States does better with our friends, and we have a lot of friends. And the challenge isn't bilateral. It's actually our system together against what China's bringing together as well. And I want to end with just a really important point here, which is that we talk a lot about competition, but you want to compete the smart way, not the dumb way, right? And the smart way is, again, with a lot of other countries, but it's also thinking about how you manage that competition responsibly. I think one of the singular achievements of the last 3 years has been to do all of this stuff with allies and partners, to take really important competitive steps, whether on export controls on certain semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, on the flow of investment into America and out of America into China, really major economic adjustments to the U.S.-China relationship, huge movements with allies and partners, while at the same time, for the most part, managing the competition and preventing it from getting to the darkest days of the Cold War. As Colin mentioned, there are some big differences. This is one of them. This is not a Cuban Missile Crisis moment. Maybe one day there'll be a Berlin airlift moment, but we're not there at this exact time. And I think that managing competition is about fundamentally finding a way to communicate with the PRC and meet with them when you need to dispel misperception, to address miscommunication, to give them a sense of what you're going to do before you do it sometimes so that there's no confusion about what your aims and intentions are. You cannot capital R reassure the PRC. They have a very dark view of the United States. But you can small r reassure the PRC, tactically reassure them, to prevent things from getting completely out of hand in the short term. And that is, I think, what has been possible with these steps over the last 3 years. And again, the singular cornerstone of a lot of that is the alliance network. Thanks.
Thanks, Rush. Let me go to Matt. What are your thoughts?
Look, I think that the Biden administration deserves credit for a lot of the work that Rush was just describing, that is pulling allies closer. But where the Biden administration has been much less effective is in deterring adversaries in the seams when we're talking about countries that are not formal allies of the United States. We saw the Taliban roll right into Afghanistan before we even had a chance to get on airplanes and evacuate. Ukraine is not a NATO ally. It is an independent sovereign country that we had promised back in the 90s to protect, although not to make a formal treaty ally. And President Putin of Russia decided that he didn't think we had the stomach and to defend Ukraine, and he steamrolled right in. Israel is a very close partner of the United States, but it is not actually a treaty ally of the United States. And so Iran has attacked Israel using terrorist proxies like Hamas and Lebanese Hezbollah and the Houthis and various Shia militia in places like Iraq and beyond. So Morgan made this key point, which is that deterrence is what really matters right now, and we're failing at it. We are failing at it in ways that I think are incredibly dangerous and provocative. I think look southward for the next one. I think we'll see a crisis later this year on the border of Venezuela and Guyana. Venezuela, backed by China, Russia, and Iran. This new axis is threatening to annex its independent sovereign neighbor, Guyana, because they've got a lot of oil. And so Morgan also made an important point, which is that this isn't a Biden administration problem. This is a Washington, D.C. problem. It's both parties that are failing to learn the lessons that were written in blood during World War II, namely that deterrence is a whole lot better and a whole lot cheaper than war. And yet, we are now showing that we don't even have the stomach for deterrence. When you have a fight like the one that's taking place today, I'm praying for the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, that he's able to get this aid package through, because there are people on the right as well as on the left that don't think that we should be supporting countries around the world in ways that would only invite a much more expensive and costly and deadly set of conflicts in Europe and in the Middle East and in other places around the world after that.
Morgan, he brought your name up a couple times there, so I'm going to give you a chance to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is where I say you were just talking about AUKUS, and I was a big fan of that, big cheerleader, and I don't normally cheerlead Biden administration policy, at least on the Middle East, but I've been a very big fan for what you guys did in Asia. But the problem is, as I said, we can't realistically deliver those submarines to Australia anytime soon. I mean, the ranking member in the Senate on Senate Armed Services have said this. We know this because we just, as I said, cut an attack sub this year. So it's where I worry, and again, this is not a critique of the Biden administration. They can only deal with the budget that Congress gives them. But where I am worried is that we talk a very big game and then can't deliver, on the results. Saying that, we revived the Quad in the Trump administration. I think they had not met for like 7 years whenever we started those meetings again. The fact that it's leader level is fantastic. AUKUS is another great deal. Being in Taiwan, watching the president meet with the Japanese and the Philippine President Marcos as well. I mean, these are all fantastic signs. I think they're all signs that China, things that China are looking at and they're watching. I think probably the most important thing we could do, the collective we, over the next 3 to 4 years, 5 years, as we get towards the end of the 20s, is double and triple down on our alliance and partnerships in Asia. Even when you look at the supplemental and the 20 different forms that they're voting on over the next few days. A lot of money for Ukraine and Israel. There is some money for Indo-Pacific and for Taiwan, but it's much smaller proportionally. And so that's another place when I talk about, putting our money where our mouth is as it relates to policy in addition to rhetoric. I think it's time to start looking at our military aid in Asia as well. Obviously, what's going on in Ukraine is incredibly important, and the outcome could have ramifications. But I think doubling and tripling down on our alliance structure in Asia is going to be incredibly important. But it's going to have to be more than just meetings with leaders. We're going to have like really substantive, tangible things that we're bringing to the table. And I just think, unfortunately, in our current budget environment, we're not there.
So, Colin, I was noticing through some body language that you may want to say something there. I think maybe we should play poker together. I don't know.
No, I care about my money too much. Look, I think that there's probably violent agreement that there's things we could do better. Okay, we can have a debate about whether the defense budget is the right level, but the first thing we should do is pass budgets. Okay, you might not. Maybe you believe that $825 billion is enough. Maybe you think it should be $1 trillion. But I'll tell you what's not enough: not having a defense budget for 6 months. And that's not Joe Biden's fault, okay? So let's get that straight. So that's thing one. Thing two, Ukraine was a huge wake-up call for our defense industrial base, and for Europe's defense industrial base, and for the Indo-Pacific's defense industrial base. And I think one of the great things is that at the intersection of concerns about China and the fragility of the defense industrial base across the free world displayed by Ukraine is that now we have an opportunity to see the defense industrial base of the free world as a public good of the free world. And I think a lot of what we're doing now with Japan, but also with countries like India and opportunities we have in Europe, but shame on us if we don't take those opportunities to invest in our collective defense industrial base. We also need to be better at innovating and moving commercial technologies into the military sphere. We see that. We have opportunities to do better. But I will also say we have opportunities to do worse. One of the reasons why we've made so much headway multilaterally in the Indo-Pacific is because, and Tuna, this was your question, because China's policy is overwhelmingly coercive and transactional, whereas ours is not. But it could be. If the United States turns towards a nationalistic, unilateral, and coercive and transactional approach, you don't pay your dues and you're out of the club, China will eat our lunch in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. The ace in the hole for us, see, poker reference, are our alliances and partnerships, and we should not take those for granted. If you do not nurture them every single day, they will die, and as a consequence, our adversaries will benefit. The last point, we should have learned the lesson from the 20 years after 9/11 that spending 20 years in the Middle East did not help us with China. So even as powerful as we are, yes, I worry about what's going on in the Middle East. Yes, I worry about what's going on in Europe. But we shouldn't pretend that if we put equal effort everywhere around the globe, we will well position ourselves to contend with China. We have to make choices. And while we are getting better with our defense budget, our defense industrial base, all these things that we're talking about up here, we have to make hard choices. Because if you don't make those choices, we will squander our power elsewhere, as we did for the 20 years after 9/11.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. Actually, this is a topic that several of you brought up in some of your other answers, but I think it's an important one. China has made it very clear that they want to be the leader in the world when it comes to technology and specifically artificial intelligence. Many people believe, in fact, this was mentioned in one of our previous panels, that the U.S. currently has an advantage in this area. Given the economic and national security implications, what should be our approach to the development of AI, quantum, and advanced IT capabilities in order to maintain U.S. advantage vis-a-vis China? Gordon?
We do have advantages, and I think what we need to do is dust off the Reagan playbook, and that was to use our economic power to bring down the Soviet Union, which was a malicious actor. And we can do this by cutting off technology. Unfortunately, we've had technological cooperation with China, and it hasn't worked out very well for us. So, for instance, in 2014, the Obama administration, President Obama did something very important. He imposed a moratorium on the federal funding of gain-of-function research in the United States. So what did the National Institute of Health do? It outsourced that to China, specifically the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We need to stop this. And we need to cut off technology to China because we know what they plan to do. They tell us all the time. And it's not just Taiwan or Philippines or Japan or India, it's also us. So at least from a strategic point of view, but as well from a moral point of view, we should not be enriching and strengthening a regime that is targeting the United States. So I think the Biden administration has done some very important things in terms of cutting off chips and chip-making equipment to China, but we need to go much further than the political consensus in Washington will now permit. You know, and we can see this in terms of TikTok. We have known for years that China's been using TikTok to illegally steal data from Americans, and they're continuing to do that. More important, they use the curation algorithm to not only propagate their notions on the Ukraine war or Hamas, but they also use it to target a generation of American youth by promoting self-harm, suicide, drug use. And yet we do not have the political will to either force a sale or to ban TikTok. This is a known national security threat, and we have decided as a nation not to do anything about it, to let China continue this. So although I know it sounds harsh, but we do need to stop technical cooperation with China. And you know, as I said, look at the way, as Matt talked about in terms of the Reagan view on the Cold War, we were able to use our economic leverage to bring a peaceful conclusion to that struggle. And I think that we need to do the same thing right now. And remember, this is not just some sort of general theory that we have a competition with China. China right now is waging proxy wars on 3 continents: in Ukraine, North Africa, and the Middle East. It's threatening our allies. You talk about allies, and very important points you make, Colin. Threatening our allies now in Asia. So we should be considering this an imminent threat and start to do things that are now politically thought to be impossible. But history is going to look at us and say, why did you strengthen a regime that was obviously targeting you?
Thank you, Gordon. Matt.
I agree with everything that Gordon just said. Look, on the military front, we don't need to match China ship for ship. China now has, by one estimate I saw that leaked from the U.S. Navy, 200 times our shipbuilding capacity. But what we have, because we have a qualitative edge, because we still attract the most talented, people in the world, we still have a more efficient system of investing in innovative technologies. We can acquire qualitative edges over Beijing militarily that would render a lot of the brute investment that China's making wasteful. And that's really what happened during the Cold War when we got it right. During the 70s, we saw that the Soviet Union was actually, for the first time, exceeding our nuclear arsenal in quantitative terms. They were building a huge capacity of conventional arms that we wouldn't have been able to stand up against just using our tanks and the soldiers that we had available in Europe in the event that the Soviets came in. So what we ended up doing was investing in silicon chips. We began making weapons that were smarter and more fearsome without having to match the Soviets dollar for dollar, tank for tank, ship for ship. And that ended up working. It persuaded the Soviets that they could not win in a Cold War or in a hot war. And that's what really led to the self-doubts in the Soviet system that allowed people, including elites within the Soviet Communist Party, to say, well, you know, if we're not going to beat the Americans, and we have an inferior economy, we have to repress our people internally, maybe we should start rethinking the fundamental pillars of this system. And that's exactly what happened. Reagan was willing to engage with the Soviets, but only from a position of strength as perceived by both the Soviets and the Americans. And he also waited until the Soviets produced a leader that he could do business with, and that came in the form of Mikhail Gorbachev. Right now, Xi Jinping is not Mikhail Gorbachev. In fact, Xi Jinping villainizes Gorbachev in some of his speeches. One of his most important speeches that Xi Jinping gave in his first month in office was an attack on Gorbachev. So we're not going to be able to do business with Xi Jinping. He means us harm. We're going to have to actually develop a position of strength by investing wisely. I agree with Colin that we can't be everywhere without weakening ourselves in places that really matter. But we can be a lot smarter and more decisive in our use of force in ways that will brush back adversaries like Iran. The Iranians fundamentally fear the United States, but right now they've seen that they can get away with killing Americans in Jordan, shooting at our warships in the Red Sea, massacring civilians through their terrorist proxies in Israel, and we are really reluctant to actually show that we can bear teeth and bite when we need to. I think if we were to do that, we would restore deterrence.
Thanks, Matt. Rush, I know you wanted to jump in. If you could be brief, because we have one final question. I'm going to ask everybody to answer it. So if you...
Well, yeah, I will be brief. I just wanted to add that in technology competition, a critical question is what you do at home. We haven't talked a lot about the home front. We talked about that in the defense industrial-based context, but we should talk about it in the technology context. And what's great about this conference is we have people here from all kinds of industries, from all over the country, people who go back to different industries and take lessons with them, about how the world is evolving. But the key American competitive advantage in technology will define in many ways the competition for the future. The United States now is making investments in semiconductor manufacturing, in infrastructure, and also in a number of technologies critical to combating climate change. It's experimenting with industrial policy in ways it hasn't done in decades, maybe since you could argue the Cold War. And all of these efforts are having results. And we have manufacturing investment in America going up 2-3x in the last few years alone. I say this because I think this is an important part of competition. But second, just very quick element to it that also matters is our advantages in technology are not just ours. Many of them are shared with our allies and partners. And to Colin's point, if you don't have friends internationally, that technology will find its way to go to other places. You need the Japanese, the Dutch, others to work with you sometimes to make sure that the free world has the commanding heights of this technology. That is not a unilateral U.S. mission. It's a shared mission. And that means we have to find ways to work with our allies and partners to sustain our technology innovation ecosystem. Thanks.
Great points. Thanks, Rush. Okay, so with our remaining time, let's bring this all together. How would each of you describe what our overarching national strategy in regards to China should be? And please do your best to touch on each of the elements that we just really discussed as it relates to national power: diplomatic, information, military, economic. We have about 2 to 3 minutes for each of you, and I'm going to go right down the line. So we'll begin with Gordon.
The most important thing we need to do is to acknowledge what is happening in the world today. We don't want to do that because when we acknowledge it, we realize how awful things are at this particular moment. But we need to do that. We're a far stronger country than China, but if we don't start to think about reality, we're going to lose our country. So the most important thing, we need to go back to Ronald Reagan saying, we win, they lose, employing the national power of the United States across the spectrum in order to end the rule of the Communist Party in China, because we cannot deal with Xi Jinping, who believes that it's his mission to establish worldwide Chinese rule and to destroy the American state. The most important thing, we've had a policy of engagement of China, especially after the Cold War, and we had hoped that by engaging the party, that it would realize it would be in its interest to uphold the international system. What happened, of course, was that the party believed not that it had an interest in maintaining the current system, but in bringing it down and replacing it with something which we could not accept. But the one thing by engaging China that we did do, we changed the Chinese people. And I think we changed them almost irrevocably. And I believe that they want a better society. And we know this because we can see the unprecedented surge of Chinese migrants across our southern border. And that is an indication that they want to live in a free society. Now, Morgan, you mentioned you were a spokesperson for Secretary of State Pompeo. On my sister's birthday, which is July 23, 2020, Secretary Pompeo gave a speech at the Nixon Library in which he talked about America's engagement of the people of China. And during the comments afterwards, he mentioned that the one thing that the Chinese regime was most upset when he did, and Pompeo did a lot of things that upset the Chinese regime, and thank God that he did, but the thing that he did that most upset the Chinese regime was talking to the Chinese people. We need to do a lot more of this because that's the way to win this struggle peacefully.
Thank you, Gordon. Colin.
So a couple things to pull some threads together. First, I think that we need to lean into our strengths, and that starts by fostering our innovation ecosystem here at home. You know, a number of years ago, Kai-Fu Lee predicted that China would dominate AI because all the major innovations had happened. China had more engineers, and it was just about data, and China had more data. None of that is true. And there's a reason why OpenAI and Anthropic and Google are the leaders in that technology. Turns out you can't train ChatGPT on a censored internet. So there are real advantages. We need to continue to engage in that. But that also means protecting those advantages and defending ourselves. So more resilient supply chains, export controls over critical national security technologies, investment screening, control over our data. I think that, frankly, there's a lot of bipartisan agreement around those things, and I hope we can continue to do that. That's thing one. Thing two is we need to invest in ourselves, the infrastructure that we pushed aside for too many years. It's not enough to have infrastructure weeks. It turns out you have to have infrastructure bills. It's good that we have one now that's investing hundreds of billions of dollars alongside the CHIPS and Sciences Act and the IRA. And even if you think climate change isn't a real thing, and it's a thing, we need to compete with China on the clean energy technologies that will be the other technological basket of things that will determine the most competitive economy for the rest of this century, apart from things like AI and quantum, et cetera. So we need to continue to invest in ourselves. Third, we need to invest in our defense. We've talked a lot about that up there. That means our defense industrial base. That means in deterrent strategies that emphasize denial, but also resilience, because we know they're going to come after our networks. I think there's actually a lot of good continuity between the 2018 and 2022 national defense strategies. Let's keep that up. All right. The fourth is that we need to invest in our allies and partners. We've talked about that. If we turn away from that anytime in the near future, we're not going to win this competition or Cold War, however you describe it. The fifth is we have to invest in our democracy. Because if we can't govern, if we can't function, if we tear each other apart, none of this will matter. None of it. So that is, in many respects, our highest priority. Let me conclude with this. We should do all of this as what Americans do best. Be optimistic. For years, people have been talking about how China was rising, they were going to eat our lunch. Raise your hand if you've heard an argument that China is going to eclipse us. Raise your hand if you've heard that argument. Okay, now raise your hand if you'd trade places with them right now. Come on. History is littered with countries that have bet against the United States. All right, who would you rather be? You'd rather be us. If we play to our strengths, we win. That's how we win.
Thank you, Colin. Morgan.
Well, amen and hallelujah. I'm Jewish, so I like saying that. Good, got you guys to laugh. First of all, you know, I've long said when I talk about this challenge, and I mostly talk to right of center audiences by virtue of my Sirius XM radio show every Sunday on the Patriot Channel, 125, 11 to 1. Please listen. And we talk about foreign policy, but when I talk about this to these audiences, I always say the threat of China, the challenge is much bigger than one president. It's bigger than one political party. It's something that we have to take on as Americans. And I think that's an incredibly important point that Colin just made. China, I don't think ultimately can defeat us, but we can defeat ourselves. And as long as we keep looking at each other as the other half of the country as the enemy, and as long as, quite frankly, both of our presidential candidates continue to weaponize both sides sides against each other, then we're at risk of defeating ourselves. I would say I've harped on the defense budget a lot. Obviously, I have a vested interest in seeing us rebuild the Navy, and I think that that would be crucial to deterring China. But I also think we can't gloss over the fact that we have a historic recruitment crisis right now in our military. There's a lot of reasons for that. I see, other than the Marine Corps, who actually meets all of their goals, most of the other departments are throwing financial incentives at young people to try to get them to join. I don't think it's going to work because it's not inherently a financial problem. We need to get to the root causes of why young people no longer feel that the military is the right career path for them. And one of the biggest dangers is that people, their parents, their grandparents, people who served are no longer telling them, yes, I think the military is a good thing for you to go in. There's numerous reasons that we could spend a whole other panel on that, but young people need to feel that, yes, this is a country that I want to sign up to fight and die for. And as evidenced by our recruitment crisis, which I think, unless we've improved this year, was at post-Vietnam era historic lows. Maybe we should just follow the guide of the Marine Corps. They don't give financial incentives. They say your incentive is that you get to be a Marine. So I hear the oorah. So that's on the defense side, and I think we've all talked about our alliances ad nauseum here. So the only thing I would add to that is that it can't just be rhetoric. It's got to be real. If we're going to have a submarine alliance, yay, let's actually be able to build them and deliver them.
Great, thanks, Morgan. Matt?
Yeah, I like a great deal of what I just heard. So, oh yeah, especially the Marine Corps part. The look, what does Beijing fear more than anything else? It's actually quite clear when you've been looking at the problem. It's not the United States. If you look at where their budget goes, it goes to repressing their own people. Beijing fears its own people more than anything else in the world. They spend more on internal repression than they do even on their massive military buildup, once in 100-year sort of buildup. So we should be making common cause with the Chinese people. Gordon mentioned that great anecdote. I ended up getting sanctioned by the Chinese government because I gave a series of speeches in Chinese language from the White House that was really directed at them. Beijing, we should be making common cause with the Chinese people and not we should be distinguishing between the Chinese Communist Party and China as a whole, and China's people, and China's history, Chinese culture, which belongs to the Chinese people, not to this strange Leninist dictatorship that is really a foreign dictatorship. They're borrowing the ideas of Marx and Lenin and have superimposed them on a great multi-millennia culture known as China. I would say that I liked Colin's point about optimism as well. We've got to figure out a way to talk and argue with one another in ways where we're not applying ad hominem attacks on one another, where we're not attacking one another's motives. And I see Chancellor Diermeier here, who I wanted to commend for some of what you've written lately about how you're handling difficult conversations on this campus so that people actually have to argue against another person's argument and not attacking other people. So if we don't figure this out, how to transpose those values to social media, we're in trouble. But I think we might figure it out.
Thanks, Matt. Rush.
Well, thanks. It's great to be the last person to talk about what our China strategy should be, because there's not much to say. I think a lot of what's been said is exactly right. I'll just make a few quick points since we're almost out of time. You know, a lot of, as you've heard from almost everybody, a lot of successful grand strategy towards China has to be bipartisan. It also has to have the support of the American people and American industry. The wider American body politic has to also feel this is an important question, and that there's steps we have to take at home to get it right. So bipartisanship is key. Second, you know, the home front matters. What we do, again, a lot of effective China policy may not even be about China. We talk about, you know, positions of strength, okay, but strength is at home in large part. We have to invest in that foundation And if it cracks or crumbles, then we're not going to be as effective internationally. That means rebuilding our industrial base, not just our defense industrial base. It means making sure we lead in critical and emerging technology. It means making sure our educational system is training the bright minds that we used to have in the Cold War, innovating all those great technologies. We have to have that again today, regardless of whether that analogy fits. So we have to invest at home, and a lot of people in this room are involved in that very effort now. So it's not all about, the best foreign policy starts here. The second thing we have to do is align. We have to work with allies and partners around the world. We've talked a lot about the defense component of that. I mentioned a moment ago the technology component of that, the economic component of that. The United States leads a kind of an order, with a number of countries part of it. But that order isn't just rooted in our military instrument. A lot of it is rooted in our economic instrument, our technological instruments, and our political influence. And this goes to Colin's point. Our democracy and its health is an American attractive power. A lot of the countries working with us, not all of them, many of them, though, share our values dearly, and that's why they're with us. So we have to continue to steward that advantage. And finally, we have to compete effectively and smartly. I think what that means, many people on this panel will debate and continue to debate even after this panel is over. I think that's a key question. What do you say publicly? How confrontational are you versus how competitive are you? Do you take competitive actions quietly, or do you take them with heavy surround sound that's directed at your competitor? These are fundamentally tactical questions, but they're ones that are going to be critical to kind of moving ahead. What I found interesting about this panel today is that there's a lot of consensus on some of the diagnosis, and especially on the prescriptions. And I think too often, to get to Matt's point, we disagree dispositionally. Are you a China hawk? Are you a dove? Do you believe in a Cold War? Do you not? But at the end of the day, the prescriptions that we all think are important are very similar. And I think that's the key takeaway from this great conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Rush, and thanks to each one of our panelists for an absolutely fascinating, insightful conversation. Let's give them a round of applause, please.